So I'd like to introduce Brad Stone, who's the Associate Dean for BCLA, and he's going to launch us before I get into the nitty-gritty. Brad?
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I want to give thanks to Dr. Jenna McMillan, who has always been an advocate for graduate student research and putting together graduate student research panels. And I wanted to thank her for her devotion to this symposium. And we've been doing it in different ways, in different places over the years. And we're glad to finally, in the first week that LA is actually to be out on campus and sharing this with people passing by. Maybe they get a little moment of interest. Share our knowledge in the opening. For those of us who are philosophers, this was the notion of the agora, where you'd be out in the marketplace. And behind the camera here, for those who will be watching this on tape, there's an agora, there's a market going on. And here we are doing thinking out in the open with an invitation to anyone who wants to just stroll on by and hear and engage. This notion of the academy as an agoraphobic location in its ivory tower is hopefully a metaphor that will die in the 21st century. The 21st century has taught us that thinking has to happen in real time and have instant dissemination. Will we take that challenge? I'm glad that today the answer is yes. And our wonderful graduate student researchers and presenters today are doing their disciplinary thought in real time to the question of pandemic. And this would be simply the example of all the kinds of thinking that we'll be called to do in this century. And so without further ado, I simply want to say thank you to our presenters, and we look forward to thinking together. Thank you.
So again, welcome. I'm Gigi McMillan, the Acting Director of the Bioethics Institute here at LMU, and I'll be the facilitator for the symposium. This event highlights some of the BCLA graduate programs. It will offer a taste of the different perspectives that one finds in liberal arts, and it will give you a glimpse of our students who study, think, write, and share about abstract concepts and topics important to daily life. And so today's theme is pandemics, historical and contemporary. Each speaker will offer 10 minutes of remarks and then 10 minutes of remarks from the lens of their field, all on this same theme: theology, bioethics, yoga studies, and philosophy. And after each presentation, there'll be about 10 minutes or so for discussion with you, the audience, and among the speakers. After all the presentations, there will be time for a more general conversation or to revisit any particular comments. So I want you to know the Dean of BCLA has provided some snacks. There's popcorn in the back table, please enjoy. There's materials about some of our graduate programs here on this table, and scattered among the chairs with clothespins and clipboards are the bios of our speakers, and I just weighted them down so they wouldn't blow away, so feel free to ruffle through those. And with that, help me welcome our first speaker, Laura Boysen Aragon from Theological Studies.
Thank you, Dr. McMillan. Thank you, Dr. Stone. Thank you, Dr. Hoover, for the opportunity to do this. Iyanna, Alexis, and Bryan, I'm looking forward to your remarks as well. In the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, as we secluded ourselves from others and witnessed magnitudes of illness and death, God could seem distant or absent, or maybe even vengeful. It can feel that same way as we witness a war in Ukraine right now. But is it these moments when our relationship with God is tested that we can come to understand how we see God and how that perception and relationship impacts our response to events in the world? My comments today are coming from the social location of a white, cisgender, straight Catholic woman. As a theologian, I recognize that my social location affects my perspective and can create blind spots. With this social location in mind, I'm going to use the term God throughout this conversation, but use whatever term feels most appropriate for you. As with other catastrophes, it is easy to question God's involvement in this pandemic. One view that I hear over and over again is the idea of God's will or God's plan. An omnipotent and omnipresent God acting as the puppet master and pulling the strings for each of life's events. If we leave everything in the world to God's doing, how do we account for both an all-knowing and good God and the evil in the world? God becomes a punishing God. Those who suffer are punished, and those who stay healthy somehow escape God's wrath. Indeed, the AIDS epidemic brought out people saying that the virus was a punishment for the sin of homosexuality. Yet Scripture tells us that each human was made in God's image and likeness. Gay, straight, woman, man, transgender. We are all made in God's image. The fancy term we use in theology is imago Dei. If we are all made in God's likeness, no one deserves to be punished with AIDS, or COVID-19, or other illnesses, or war. On the contrary, if we believe we are blessed because we are healthy, because we are American, because we follow the rules, what do we think of those who are ill, or who are refugees? If we believe we are punished by God for sin, pandemics and war are a time when it appears God is punishing many people who must all be sinners. In his recent book, The Whole Language, Father Greg Boyle tells us, if our God makes us feel unworthy and in debt, wrong God. If God frightens us, wrong God. If God is endlessly disappointed in us, wrong God. God roots for us more than calls the shots. Another view may be to ask, where is God in all of this? Is God absent? Has God left us to die? Sick people and those who are dying may feel abandoned by God. The authors of the Gospels of Matthew and Mark tell us that at the end of Jesus' life, he cried out, my God, why have you forsaken me? How many of us can relate to Jesus' words when we are ill, when someone near us is dying? And yet what many theologians, especially liberation theologians, take from Jesus' experience is that having been through it personally, Jesus as God accompanies us in our suffering. Mystic and theologian Howard Thurman speaks of a God who stands with those who have their backs against the wall. Those who are on ventilators or living in a war-torn country certainly are trapped as though their backs are against the wall. God is right here with us and with those who are suffering. And as such, our response too should be one of accompaniment. How can we walk with our brothers and sisters in their suffering? One suggestion for a first step is to recognize that God is accompanying them already. Some have adopted the survival of the fittest mentality. I've heard some argue that they didn't need the vaccine because God would protect them, or because they believed COVID would result in this survival of the fittest. One bishop said that he was not getting the vaccine because he was a healthy person. But that misses the point. Blindly trusting in God's protection, choosing to ignore science, or focusing on protection only for yourself misses the mark. It also ignores the systemic inequalities and systemic racism that define U.S. society. Just as God does, we are called to accompany our sisters and brothers to make choices that will help to protect both them and us. Choices that reflect a care for all of those who are made in God's image and likeness, not just those whose image and likeness looks like us. In Father Brian Massingale's prophetic book, Racial Justice in the Catholic Church, he talks about the racially selective sympathy and indifference prevalent in the U.S. He says, certain lives become easier to ignore. Certain lives have a higher claim upon public energy and concern. We see people as the other. We certainly saw this disparity during the pandemic. When frontline workers, who were commonly people of color or people of lower economic means, became expendable. When science showed us that wearing a mask did more to protect those around us, failing to wear a mask to the grocery store puts those workers at risk. Those workers who are made in God's image. A 2020 study published by the American Psychological Association demonstrated that in the U.S., God is commonly imaged as an omnipotent and all-knowing creator, and as an older white man. The purpose of this study was to demonstrate the psychological barrier many people have to seeing women and people of color as leaders. But I would argue that our image of God goes beyond our image of leaders, and to the very root of human dignity. For women and people of color, if we fail to see God as looking like us, so too we may fail to recognize that we are made in God's likeness. On the other hand, failing to recognize God in people who do not look like us perverts our image of God. If those most vulnerable to the pandemic do not look like us, if we do not try to accompany them in their suffering, we are guilty of racially selective sympathy and indifference. Petitions are circulating on change.org to remove Kelly Lattimore's painting that depicts George Floyd as Jesus from the Catholic University of America campus, where the displayed prints have been stolen and some students have described the work as blasphemous. If we are all created in God's image and likeness, we must see Christ in George Floyd, in the grocery checker, and in ourselves. Thank you.
So I would ask, do any of our speakers have a comment or a question of Laura? Yes. Can you use the microphone right there? You just have to turn it off.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your perspective. That was beautiful. I think the thing that comes to mind is when I think about Buddhism and the Bodhisattva and looking at this understanding that suffering exists in the world on all fronts, and as humans, as beings, as sentient beings, to have compassion for people first is really like a good way to kind of move forward. So that's kind of what my initial thoughts that came to mind, and I'll pass the mic as I'm formulating more, but that's really kind of what's sitting with me.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that relates to that accompaniment, right? Like when we have compassion, we're like sharing with that person, sharing in their emotions. So that's a great point. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you. That was a really good paper. I really enjoyed it. And I think the thing that made me think the most, which was interesting, is how that image of God, of the old white man, how that pervades all of society, even secular society, even amongst atheists too. So it makes me think, how do you break sort of something like that? This goes to basketball coaches, presidents, there's this problem with like representation. what do you think are the most effective ways? I mean, there's probably not an effective way, but what are certain ways that, because this is probably something religion is going to have to be the sort of battering ram on. What are some of the main ways that you think that this can be kind of remedied?
That's a great question, and I think
It's a hard one. Sorry.
It's the $1 million question, which is great. What we see, I think what we talk about a lot in theology is that there is no one theology. There are many theologies. And I recently watched a TED Talk, and where the woman talked about the problem of having one story. It's the woman. She's a Nigerian author who wrote Americana. I'm forgetting her name. Okay, so, and she talked about, as a kid she grew up and she read these storybooks that were from Europe or the US, and so she always had this vision of stories that were very white. Like that was how she pictured stories. And it's so important that we hear all of these different stories. And I think that's what the church is really, we call things traditional if they're European, right? And even you see it in the war in Ukraine, you hear people talking about, oh, this is devastating, this is a civilized society, and then you're saying, well, what are you talking about? So some people deserve this because they're not white or European? Like, why are we more appalled because the white people are at war? It's terrible. But like, when the Iraqis and the Syrians are at war, where is our accompaniment there? So I think the stories are really important, hearing them, sharing them, like we need to know them. In religion, we see, it's that George Floyd image. Like, we need to look at images that show God. Harmonia Rosales is another artist, and she's painted, it's Michelangelo's David, or Adam, God touching Adam, and she paints it with two black women, and it's amazing. And I think people look at it, and some people are appalled and think it's blasphemous. Other people, oh my God, I see God in myself. Like, I could be that person, or I just see God is totally different, or the divine is totally different than, how I'd imagined it. And so it is this, like, we need to be, Dr. Martin Luther King talks about this tension. We need to be welcoming that tension, because right now it's pretty easy to be a white person, right? And so we need to welcome in some tension and some challenge, and we need to hear stories that don't resonate with us, and then, how can we change our perspective? And then those additional stories will resonate with others, and that just, then we all feel more involved and we can be part of this. So, and those are two of probably a million options, but yeah, thanks for that question.
Thank you so much, Laura. I just wanted to ask, what role do you think American individualism plays in this struggle?
Yeah, I mean, I think it plays a huge role in this struggle. We believe in a market, right? Like, as Americans, capitalism has become this sort of god, I think, where, well, I am succeeding, I am making money, I must be a good person, I must be doing this right? Like, I'm wealthy, so God is blessing me because I have wealth or I have fortune. And I think that's a huge problem. To assume that, someone who is not as, wealthy or fortunate that they've done something. Because I think, as I mentioned, we swim in this water of systemic inequality and systemic racism. So if I'm only looking out for myself and I'm a white person, I'm pushing people down along the way, right? And I think the individualism, and Pope Francis really takes people to task on this. I think that our economy is really based on this individual get ahead model. And so the challenge is really sort of upending all these, or changing all these structures where if I look out for me, if I am saved as an individual, then I'm okay. And then, ignoring what other, you can't really accompany people if you're only looking out for your own salvation. So, I think that's a huge part of it. Thanks, Alexis.
Excellent answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So our next speaker is Iyanna Newborn from Yoga Studies, and I really look forward to these.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today. And I'll dive right in. What modern society understands to be yogasana is but a microcosm of the macrocosm that is yoga. Philosophical discourse within yoga examines the total person, body, mind, and spirit, an individual's place in the universe and the interconnectedness of all life forms. Yogic philosophy extols the earth. We venerate Mother Earth, the sustainer and preserver of forests, vegetation, and all things that are held together firmly. She is the source of a stable environment. Quote from the Artha Veda. Earth, our stable environment, is in decline. Human actions have contributed to the degradation of Earth's ecosystems, a fact established 30 years ago at the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. When examining human impact on the Earth, the predominant discussion has evolved around global warming and climate change. Less politicized evidence suggests land alterations, such as urbanization and deforestation, disrupt vital ecosystems that support biodiversity. Loss of biodiversity has been found to contribute to an increase in disease spread and epidemics. This prompts the question, did our current relationship with the Earth lead to the global spread of the highly contagious pathogen known as SARS-CoV-2, or as you know it, COVID-19? Evidence of Earth's decline is apparent through global warming. Carbon dioxide, methane, and other greenhouse gases warm the Earth by reflecting infrared radiation to the surface. Humans contribute to the problem through everyday activities. The combustion of fossil fuels, petroleum, coal, natural gas, contribute to air pollution. Urban development, industrial agriculture expansion, and mining are prominent examples of human influence leading to global deforestation and habit loss. While climate change is instrumental in the loss of glaciers and rising sea levels, the most serious threat might be to biodiversity. A model for how life continues, biodiversity equates to variation among genes and species within Earth's biosphere. Rich, even, heterogeneous biodiversity supports a healthy ecosystem and ecological processes. The loss of biodiversity negatively impacts natural resources. Through systematic review, Cardinal et al. Found a reduction in the number of genes, species, and functional groups of organisms, biodiversity, reduces the efficiency by which communities capture biologically essential resources, nutrients, water, light, prey, and convert those resources into biomass. With human life being dependent on natural resources to thrive, loss of biodiversity can have negative implications for human health. Relationships between organisms within an ecosystem impact conditions influencing disease transmission. Land use changes can potentially destroy entire ecosystems and increase the proximity between humans and wildlife, and thereby increase the potential for zoonotic pathogens and vector-borne diseases to move between wildlife and human populations. Researchers have found approximately 75% of emerging diseases, major pandemics like HIV, Ebola virus, Zika, avian and swine influenza, and COVID-19, were all zoonotic in origin. Deforestation, dam and irrigation projects have increased exposure to malaria and other vector-borne diseases. Research on disease ecology has shown deforestation of fruit bat habitats forced them to roost in fruit trees in human settlements. Increased exposure to humans has resulted in zoonotic disease outbreaks. In the United States, as avian and diversity falls, human exposure to West Nile virus increases. Continued degradation of the earth has created dissonance between humans and natural ecosystems, thus fueling the circumstances that created the current pandemic and possible future pandemics. Philosophical and religious texts transcribed in pre-modern India emphasize having a harmonious relationship with the earth. One area this can be seen through is the story of creation. how earth, sky, and beings came into existence. The Rig Veda, Upanishads, and other canonical texts illustrate the story of creation from the perspective of three veils of existence: the gross, or physical, the astral, or mental, and the causal, or spiritual planes. The Maitreya Upanishad presents a world the Lord of creation builds. Now verily this world was unuttered, when he, the soul, Atman, who is Prajapati, Lord creation, had performed austerity. He uttered Bur, earth, Bhuvas, atmosphere, Sva, sky. In this paradigm, earth, atmosphere, and sky parallel the body's gross, astral, and causal planes. The earth and the human body can be considered extensions of each other, the same. How one treats the earth is how one treats their own body. The Prativi Sukta of the Artha Veda, another pre-modern text, is entirely devoted to Mother Earth and describes how sentient beings should praise, protect, and interact with her. May we live longer in order to serve our land, who is the mother of all medicinal plants and vegetation. She is the one who has given us an immense space, and it is she who grants us the needed firmness. May our behavior be in accord with Dharma of the earth for securing stability and happiness. Vedic philosophers recognize the need to safeguard the earth from pollutants and human interference. Without protection, the air will become unbreathable, water undrinkable, and the forests will disappear. An influx of research is currently being done on how physical practice, yogasana, pranayama, or breathwork, and meditation can support patients suffering from COVID-19. While this research is significant, it could be argued that adopting a yoga philosophy through lifestyle and mindset shifts could create sustainable change for the greater good and environment. When considering how to interact with the earth moving forward, two profound pre-modern teachers come to mind. Believed to be an incarnation of the Holy Trinity of Hindu gods, Sri Dattatreya could be considered an environmentalist. He gained insight by observing the world around him, surveilling 24 aspects in nature: the earth, the sky, the water, and different sentient beings became his gurus, or teachers, helped him realize his true essence and solidify his connection with the ultimate creator. Sri Dattatreya's teachings encourage individuals to see the world as sacred and regard Dharma as an ethical and moral guide for conduct when interacting with the environment. Patanjali Maharishi believed yoga could be a tool for transformation and a means to alleviate human suffering. Within the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, a book of philosophical tenets, he presents an eightfold path to live a balanced life. The first two facets are relationship guidelines or ethical instructions, yamas and niyamas, on how to interact with the external world and evolve towards harmony. Ahimsa, non-violence. Asteya, non-stealing, non-hoarding. Brahmacharya, balance and moderation. Aparigraha, non-possessiveness. Santosha, contentment. Svidhyaya, self-study. In living by these precepts, one rethinks their relationships with the Earth's ecosystems. As abundance is recognized and gratitude embraced, consumerism and greed no longer govern one's actions. Overpopulation, urbanization, and industrial agriculture lead to alterations in ecosystems across the globe and negatively impact biodiversity. Poor biodiversity creates an environment that allows zoonotic and vector-borne diseases to move between wildlife and human populations. In 2019, a potentially deadly transmissible pathogen surfaced in China and rapidly spread globally. While the origins of COVID-19 is highly debated, Holmes et al. Found that all other SARS-CoV outbreaks, 7 over the past 20 years, have zoonotic origins, 2 of which can be traced back to wildlife-human spillover at markets similar to the Wuhan market that's believed to be ground zero for COVID-19. More research is needed to determine the origin of COVID-19. However, further consideration of preventing future pandemics should take precedent. Saving human beings from this and future pandemics means encouraging modern society to regard yogic, philosophical, and spiritual teachings when interacting with the earth. Recognizing humans and the earth are the same, made of the same minerals, and treating the earth with reverence and respect. May our bodies enjoy only clean, pure water. May you keep away from us that which is polluted, and may we always only do good deeds. Quoted from the Artha Veda. Thank you.
I was wondering if anybody out here in the chairs has a question or a comment. Sure.
Yeah, could you give a little more detail on the zoonotic and how concern for animal transmission might be mediated by, say, the yoga practice of vegetarianism?
Yes, so
Can you repeat his question?
oh, sure. So Dr. Chappell has asked about the zoonotic disease transmission and how the practice of yoga, when considering vegetarianism or veganism, could kind of alleviate some of that struggle, I guess you could say. One thing about yoga is really recognizing the interconnectedness of all life forms and the energy that is in those life forms. So some of the religions like Jainism, they really champion ahimsa and do no harm. And that is from yourself, your body, your neighbor, but also the animals around you, the organisms around you. Jainists wear sometimes masks over their face, which we have been doing for COVID-19 to protect each other, but their original notion for wearing that was to protect the organisms so they don't harm them. So when we think about disease transmission between wildlife and humans, if we start to think more compassionately about animals specifically and really what we're doing to the environment, manipulating their homeland and treating them as us and treating their habitat as our habitat and really kind of having more compassion for them, then maybe, yes, we can kind of subside that.
Do any of our speakers have a comment or question?
Well, I have a comment too.
So thank you. That was wonderful. And I think the thing I appreciated the most was centering the environmental issue, because I think people sort of partition different problems as if they're not connected, but like the environment is the big one in the background of a lot of these problems. And I think it's so true that there's this lack of harmony, and that can be individual harmony, which yoga is, yoga and meditation is supposed to bring that back. There's a societal harmony that's lost, and then there's the natural harmony that's being lost too. And I think the fact that all those registers are connected in a microcosmic, macrocosmic way is, very important to keep in mind. So it was mostly just a comment. I just really appreciated that.
Thank you for that. I will just respond. You asked earlier about how the image of God can kind of be started to kind of look differently for people, and I think that kind of goes back to a little bit what I'm saying too. Is like when you see the earth as yourself, when you see God inside of yourself as yourself, because you are that God, that higher power, you are a co-creator in this world, then that's really where that starts. And that's, one of the reasons why I appreciate yoga and that spiritual movement so much, is because you do recognize you are a co-creator in this world to see that. So thank you.
Thank you, Iyanna. That was fantastic. What this brought to mind for me is in theology, we have a theologian who we learn about, Elizabeth Johnson, who talks a lot about, she has like an eco-feminist theology, and talking about how we've misinterpreted Genesis, the book of the Bible, forever, and that humans having dominion over the earth doesn't mean that we control it all and we're supposed to be in charge of it all, but rather we're supposed to live symbiotically with it and take care of it. We're the stewards to help take care of it. So, I mean, your issue, I think, resonates across so many different studies and areas. It's amazing. And I liked and I wondered what you think about, I think what we struggle with is this rugged individualism in America, and kind of this, and even with yoga, I see it sometimes where it's like goal oriented, right? Like I need to be the thinnest or do my downward dog for the longest or whatever it is. And, what do you think about that? Like within your own industry and practice?
Yeah, so thank you for that. First, the first part of your comment, yes, I will go back and look up this book, because I do believe that. I was able to sit in a forum with a scholar on Aramaic, and she talks about how the translations with the Bible, a lot is missed when you think about Aramaic, when you think about these ancient languages like Sanskrit. Like there's so much meaning and so much depth to what they're actually saying, and when we translate it, we tend to miss a lot. And so going back to those original texts and looking at those translations, I do think we can learn a little bit more. As far as the modern interpretation of yoga, that's why I joined this program. Like I really appreciate Dr. Chappell and Dr. Fazio and even Amy for creating this space for us to have this conversation in this Discord. This conversation about how to impact the industry, because it takes a few of us at a time going out into the world and creating change. It's not going to happen overnight, but yeah, we I think are on the cutting edge of that. I'm looking at Dr. Chappell, and he's like, yeah, I think so.
That's great. Thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thank you very much.
And now I'd like to bring up Alexis Harris from Bioethics.
Woo!
Beautiful acts to follow, and I'm sure proceed. Top of the afternoon, everyone. I will hop right into it. I will be responding to our prompt to consider pandemics, past, present, and future. I will discuss the patterns of treatment and response in the midst of novel pandemics at the height of uncertainty, and how our efforts fragment in establishing accessible treatment, care, and cure for non-wealthy regions when pandemics begin to wane in the global north. We will view the COVID-19 pandemic alongside the AIDS pandemic, although AIDS qualifies as endemic in the United States. I want to draw attention to the consequences of unabated fear and the prioritization of certain populations' health over others. As we've seen, the determinants of healing are directly correlated with socioeconomic status, race, geographic location, disability, and disability status. I want to explore how novelty has been used as an excuse to ignore, mistreat, and let die. Fair concerns raised in times of health crises for safety precautions are often exploited to excuse discrimination and patient neglect. Regardless of novelty or precedence, healthcare professionals, policymakers, theological scholars, including the general public, have a civic responsibility to recognize and correct our pattern of unethical treatment, which have generated complacent attitudes towards communities and regions primarily in the global south. While hope for endemic status shows itself domestically, essentially, whose health do we actively invest in, and whose health do we let decompose when we are fine? I will highlight the trends modeled during the beginning of the AIDS pandemic, how it mirrors our response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and as time goes on, who gets left behind. It seems the declaration of endemic status of a disease is dependent on the conditions, whether they be improvement or decline in the global north. In the US, we have declared AIDS an endemic disease despite it being the leading cause of death in other regions, such as those in sub-Saharan Africa. Here are a few statistics from 2019 to provide context. AIDS is one of the world's most fatal diseases and is responsible for about 1.5 deaths annually across the globe and is the leading cause of death in some countries. In the southern sub-Saharan region, 1 in 4 deaths in South Africa, hovering at 28%, were due to AIDS, 27% in Botswana, 25% in Mozambique, 20% in Namibia, 18% in Zambia, 17% in Kenya, and 12% in the Congo, while in Europe the rate was only 0.1%. Additionally, most developed countries are between 1 to 10 deaths per 100,000. Comparatively, in the southern region of sub-Saharan Africa, the range is between 100 and 200 per 100,000. To me, this does not indicate endemic status. While I do not intend to provide a research paper for you all, the disparity clearly linked to geographic location is worth noting as it affects our perception of improvement, concentration of aid, and access to treatment and care. Our hope of endemic status in the US with COVID-19 is due to the availability and quick development of vaccines, funded research, the increasingly available effective treatments for struggling COVID-19 positive patients, and enabled by the adequate infrastructure to do so. This is while many across the world have yet to receive their first dose of the effective vaccine and are left without effective treatment to aid the afflicted. It is obvious the urgency and focus to aid and service the vulnerable is not equilateral across all regions, especially when countries like our own have the privilege to isolate resources, thus making care and preventative measures inaccessible, even with the prospect of global benefit. The concentration and hoarding of life-saving means, a practice commonly exercised by wealthy countries, looks like the stockpiling of vaccines and the ability to provide easy access to testing for fast detection, still widely unavailable to many. In the US today, there are effective treatments and management options for HIV-positive patients, some, if not most of which, are covered. Let me see. Here we go. By insurance, a possibility inconceivable for many. But this relative access to care in the US was not always a reality. I will now discuss the discrimination that enabled the death of millions and oscillate between comparison between the period of early discovery of HIV in the US and the discovery of COVID-19, which were exacerbated by distorted religious and political agendas, racism, and homophobia. During the late 70s and early 80s, at the height of HIV's initial detection in the US, it was viewed as a disease that only affected gay men, a widespread misconception and belief. Soon after its proliferation domestically, it was established that HIV was not transmitted by casual contact, air, food, water, and so on. Yet even in light of the important finding, false narratives and misconceptions prevailed. An example was that of patient O, who was portrayed as a malicious gay man who single-handedly spurred the spread of HIV in the US. There are clear elements of similarity seen in the discrimination and violence enacted against Asian Americans during our COVID pandemic. Upon it being labeled as the Chinese virus, it gave platform to the explosion of conspiracy theories, harm, and the ostracizing of Asian Americans. Likewise, gay men were men who were seen as sole agents for the spread of the virus, the HIV virus. It took years for the Reagan administration to even acknowledge the severity of the AIDS pandemic, resulting in time lost that could have gone towards research and treatment, similar to our downplaying and delay in calling out the seriousness of the back then novel COVID-19 virus. The propaganda created for HIV and AIDS and lag in concentrated care efforts was largely due to the politicizing of the disease in the interests of conservative interest groups, many viewing the spread of HIV as a gift from God to punish homosexuality. This politicizing of the COVID-19 pandemic, which have ranged in topics like masking, vaccination, and other safety measures, is reminiscent of our past errors. I would like to wrap my remarks and compare the on-the-ground reality of those infected early on, both in our COVID-19 pandemic and the AIDS pandemic prior to the spread of awareness and campaigns to dispel misinformation and raising of funds for research. In our hospitals globally, we saw an overwhelming amount of people needing care, bringing their healthcare infrastructure on the verge of collapse, with no true effective treatment options, and found themselves alone to die and unable to access life-saving treatment options. And also unable to access technologies like ventilators and the availability of oxygen. Consequently, due to these shortages, we experienced the extreme triaging of medical care. Nurses and doctors have given anecdotes of patients seen as a waste of resources and unlikely to recover. Decisions too often influenced by bias based on perceived social utility, and thrown into rooms with dozens of other positive patients left to die and gasping for breath. The AIDS pandemic left gay couples unable to see their beloved because they were not considered family, as legislation supporting LGBT rights were not commonly established in policy. Their loved ones died agonizing deaths, all while medical staff avoided administering care because of stigma and misinformation about the nature of the virus and/or personally held beliefs. The peak of fear and uncertainty with these two diseases in particular show the familiar pattern of stigmatization paired with a designated scapegoat and how it results in socially acceptable neglect. They both have been used as ammo for political agenda at the expense of millions of lives. In our next pandemic, we must not repeat our consequential errors at the expense of the vulnerable and unsuspecting. Collaboration with other countries, impoverished or wealthy, rather than exercising our famed isolationist tendencies, will be crucial to being able to swiftly transition to a mode of adaptability in our next global crisis. This will be essential to preventing the deaths and long-term chronic effects of disease for millions in the future. The proactive effort to block misinformation and propaganda from gaining traction, combating interpersonal hostility, and the deployment of empathy will prevent roadblocks to save lives worldwide in our next pandemic. Thank you.
So, Alexis, I'd just like to ask a question myself. As a bioethicist, what is your opinion on history repeating itself, as you gave an example there with HIV and COVID, and what do you think would be a remedy for us to change our pattern of dysfunction in the future?
Thank you for that. And just in my last wrapping sentence, the empathy, it seems like concrete policy and even advisement from public health officials in this very objective sense is not working. So I think it's about time we engage our emotional and sensitive capacities and assigning empathy as our main strategy for our next pandemic.
So I just want to comment, I think that's very interesting to some of the remarks from our previous speakers, right? Is that Alexis is calling for empathy as a solution to our dysfunctional response to the pandemic. And it's also a solution to some of the other issues that you all have brought up. Okay, I'm done with that. Is there any other comments or questions?
Thank you. Yeah, I think you definitely hit the nail on the head with the empathy and even calling into question, like, whose health do we invest in? And that's something that I've seen come up in research and why I'm focused on the African American community and birthing solutions, because while it's not necessarily considered a pandemic, Black women are dying giving birth to babies, and I want to know why, and I want to know if yoga can help support that in some kind of way. And I do see locally our healthcare system does have that issue of who do they support or give more voice to in those situations. So thank you for that. I advocate for compassion.
And just it's whose pain do we respond to? Who are we most responsive to in cries for help? So absolutely.
Any questions or comments? We got a couple from the audience. Brad?
Yes, thank you for this talk. Kind of as a reference, Michel Foucault, a French philosopher,
Definitely.
has a great essay called The Politics of Health. And I like the way you were ending your presentation about how can we do something different. The objectivity of the scientific community and public health does not work. And one of the reasons it doesn't work, at least from the Foucauldian point of view, is pandemic is one of the few times that a state could actually claim an absolute power. When life and death are so present in pandemic is when you can make, and lock down, real political power. And so some of the solution to what to do next time would be, how do we make pandemics less politically useful? And that's what I think causes the repetition. Every time there's a pandemic, you can really, and conservatives kind of wait on it in a certain way, in a way liberals aren't paying attention at that moment. To lock down, to take advantage of that moment. So I'm just curious about how do we make pandemics less politically useful?
If I understand what you're saying, how do we suppress the platform before it surfaces? And thank you for getting Foucault in there. He's definitely a favorite of mine. I'll say that's a good question. One, because I don't have a specific answer, or at least a correct answer. But if I were to answer, it would. I think it's a proactiveness. And I think we need to start now, as we're getting into the endemic stage, at least in the US, regarding COVID-19, kind of saying, all right, for the next time we need to stay hands off this and actually be very vocal about it. So when it comes up the next time, it's seen as a party foul. It's like, no, now we can recognize this is deterring efforts from getting out of the future pandemic. Please.
Thank you for that.
Thanks for listening.
I think in parallel to the theme of empathy, I'm hearing othering, and that this sense of othering, it's not my problem, it's others, since we're African other, it's not here, or Asian kids, no, them, not me, all this othering, and kind of the theme throughout this is not othering, that we are all, even in the yoga, I'm a yoga center, and I'm also a healthcare provider. Things that I notice is healthcare, I work at a family clinic, it's very easy to come in with an empathy of, we have, so we're going to go in and help those who don't. And I think the deeper work in that is not othering. It's not, we have, you don't have to savior. Savior concept. But really, you are me, I am you. This, and yet over that is, we are excited. There's a languaging of, there are disparities that are not, so real disparities. And so I guess the question is, how do we not other while recognizing disparities?
Maybe if we treated everyone like the American citizens, the favored American citizens, and I always say I'm very privileged to have an American passport because I can go anywhere. And if I were to have an issue in another country, my country would react very strongly. Whether that be a rescue mission, as we've seen in the past with news. we deploy a very strong response, a strong effort on behalf of American citizens. And I think if we treated other people with the proposed dignity that Americans are entitled to, or we think we're entitled to, I think the tone and energy and urgency would be very different. A rough answer.
Thank you.
Thank you. Hopefully I didn't take up too much time.
This is really lovely. Our last speaker, and not least, we're going to hear from a philosopher, Bryan Noonan.
All right, so before we started today, I was glad to go last, but now I'm not, because those were all really good papers that were given. But so I'll just jump into it. So in the wake of the pandemic, there have been whispers that we are perhaps in a new era for social thought. This obviously would affect all of the humanities. But this also potentially means that we are entering a new time for philosophy as well. This is a question I'll get to later, but first I think there's a more important question, one that needs to be answered first. The question is, when should one think philosophically? When should one properly become a philosopher? Being a philosopher obviously is not majoring in it. It's something that everyone does all the time. A philosophically minded individual will always forever answer this question. Well, right now, the unexamined life is not worth living. Be this true or not, the average person does not normally conduct themselves as a philosopher in an all-encompassing, everyday sort of manner. When Socrates implores us to examine ourselves in the nature of reality, he's asking us to make a choice, a voluntary act. I don't think this is relevant during the pandemic, though. It is perhaps the common sense notion that to conduct one's thinking philosophically is indeed a choice. However, this is only sometimes the case, and not the phenomenon I wish to speak of today. I'm rather going to talk about the times or the moments where the need for philosophy is at its most salient. There are times where philosophy comes to you. Indeed, sometimes philosophy comes to us. It hearkens to us. Sometimes we have no choice and are forced to truly think deeply about the world. Certain events interrupt us. They force us to think. They force us to question. They force us to examine the world around us. These events occur on a continuum of different scales. They can be individual, they can be societal, they can be cosmological, global, and so on. We can all think back to a time where our heart was broken, for an example. It is rare that we do not respond to heartbreak without some sort of profound questioning on the back end. We may question ourselves, what we did, what the ethics of love is, or the very nature of love itself. But regardless, what is important is that these moments of profound crisis force us to think. The COVID-19 pandemic has provided us with such a crisis. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic should not be taken monolithically. There were many other things that bubbled to the surface at this time, and its virulent spread brought with it a host of problems which demanded immediate answers to those who were willing to listen. It is in times like this that the world presents itself to us as it really is. It's a field of problematics, demanding a solution at all times. Our day-to-day lives is a negotiation with these problems which arise. Different eras obviously provide different problems. That may be what characterizes them. And these problems either arise or are illuminated by large-scale events. The Renaissance, the Industrial Revolution, the Ice Age are all examples of epochs preceded by profound events which brought about their arrival. The knife which cuts history into these individual eras does so only along the seams of these world-changing events. One cannot still be in the same manner as an individual who lived in a previous historical era. One of us could not simply become a samurai in any meaningful way in our current age because we don't live in 12th century Japan. We cannot conduct ourselves in the same mode of living as our pre-pandemic selves. As Heidegger keenly points out, the contours of our possible modes of being are profoundly shaped by the totalizing forces of our tradition, our culture, our history, Our spectrum of possibility is heavily restricted by the dominion of the they. This point is also brilliantly illustrated by Foucault in The Order of Things. Foucault uses the example of Don Quixote, a man who seeks to become a knight embodying the medieval romanticism and noble chivalry which animates the pages of all of his favorite novels. The problem is he is attempting to conduct himself according to a bygone era. During the time of Don Quixote, the structures of signification which had animated the medieval age had completely collapsed. The humor of Cervantes' novel arises from the very fact that Don Quixote is trying to embody a world which he does not reside in. His madness stems from his inability to resemble the world around him. At this time, we cannot try to be Don Quixote. We have to realize the age that we live in. During the crisis of the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw, at the very least, a partial collapse of the order of things. We, as a global community, will always bear the scar of this collapse. Our world will never be the same. We will never be the same. The pandemic changed the world to what extent or severity, only time will tell. What is important philosophically speaking is that the pandemic forced us all to think. It revealed certain problems within our society. It brought out the best and sometimes the worst in others. The truth was always illuminated. In times of crisis, the nature of things reveals itself. Despite the obvious negativity that a crisis engenders, there is also some benefit. Rarely is our vision of the world so keenly focused or are our experiences so lucid. The problems of our society lit up during the pandemic. We lack, as a country, a thoroughgoing sense of community, and we lack an adequate healthcare system, as we've been discussing. Despite its reputation for technical skill and cutting-edge innovation, our healthcare system was wholly ill-equipped to handle a large-scale health crisis. The profit-based model of our society led to the disenfranchisement of millions just in our country, not even talking about the global south, who were left to wonder if they were to be treated for a deadly virus. These are only a couple of the pernicious problems that lurk in the undertow of our society. The thoroughgoing illumination and inescapability of these problems is when philosophy becomes inevitable. The moment of crisis, especially when our mortality is involved, ruptures any collective sense of ignorant bliss by making our very life an issue for ourselves. This is true along numerous registers, individual or collective. The horrors of what is currently happening in Ukraine is the timely example. Thrust into an existential crisis, Ukraine's collective decision-making is now at its most meaningful. Across every rationale, decisions carry the reality of death and its imminent possibility at all times. It always did, but now it is at its most illuminated. It is reflection upon the inescapability of our death that often provides the occasion to be our most authentic selves despite the anxiety that death brings. This is a common theme in the works of Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and all of these are thinkers who implore that anxiety is the mood of the philosopher. So now, to answer the question, which resides in the title of my paper, are we now in a new era of philosophy? I'm going to say yes and no. Yes, each historical era will bear its own unique problematic articulations. Every paradigm will philosophize in a manner that is appropriate to its particular position in history. However, at the same time, philosophy will also harbor the same perennial questions whose ancient roots are subterranean to the entire history of philosophy. The pandemic inextricably brought us back to these ancient questions. What is death? What is the good life? What is the essence of utopia, to just name a few? These eternal questions may continually crash on the beaches of history, but they always take on a particular tenor in the particular era in which they reside. It is our job now to pick up the pieces now that the old world has been annihilated. We must now re-articulate the world as we find it around us. The world is once again calling to us to philosophize, and it is our obligation to answer the call. Thank you.
A comment or question from anybody in our chairs? I have a question.
Sure.
So the regular citizen on the sidewalk like me, who is not a philosopher, how do I personally engage with the idea of the need to philosophize
Right.
in this pandemic. What advice do you give to a regular person like me?
Right. Yeah. So I think that it just happens on its own. It's not like this sort of, oh, I'm going to go to academic philosophy and I'm going to do this. There's just certain times where I think, especially, I think back to when the grocery stores became chaos at the very beginning, once the stay-at-home order. You know, it forces you to really think about what's keeping society together. You know, it asks you to ask these big questions that, you know, philosophy exists in, I think, in almost all the humanities and in science. You know, across the academy, there's these moments of philosophy. I think they're kind of inevitable. I think the pandemic specifically, you know, I can only speak for myself. It made me really question what I want to do. What do I want to talk about in philosophy? You know, which is ethical thinking, really. And, you know, how do I want to conduct my life going forward? Because I can't go back and just be like, I'm just going to do social political philosophy from before the pandemic. You know, you can't do that. So
I'm wondering if the regular population, if we're all actually philosophizing, but we just don't know it. Like maybe when we're...
if we think so.
I mean, probably,
yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
maybe that's the answer, so we're already doing it.
Yeah, there's just moments.
We just don't call it that.
No, right. It goes by a lot of different names, but yeah. Yeah, I just think everyone does it, you know. Yeah.
All right, thank you. Iyanna.
I think that's it. I think we are all kind of in our heads and thinking. I mean, that's what led me here. I recognized that in my body, I didn't feel quite right with how I was living, and I recognized my life specifically what needed to change. And that pushed me into this direction. And I was actually really nervous about philosophy. Like, I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to be... And then as things started to click, I'm like, oh, you already think about that. Oh, it's just a matter of articulating some of these things that you already feel. So I think we do that naturally when we go to church or when we're looking for a higher power or God or just answers to the universe. I think a lot of people do that innately.
Right, yeah. That's really true. Yeah, I mean, I think there's always moments when, you know, even people who would never call themselves a metaphysician do it. You know, or people always make the joke that toddlers are metaphysicians because they're asking how everything, the big questions about reality, because they're just curious. You know, I think it's just natural.
I think your comments tied so many of these other pieces together beautifully. So, you know, I don't know whether you planned that, but it was perfect. And one thing that I was thinking about is the question Dr. McMillan asked is, how do we have history not repeat itself? And I find people being thoughtful now, and then we're going to get back into the doing of the everyday life. And is there a new normal, or do we just go back to the... So I guess it's sort of a broad question, but like, how do philosophers think about that? Is just the short-term memory that we might have.
Right, yeah. I mean, and also I think philosophy is useless if there's no practical output on the other end. You know, you can think about this all day, but if it's just theoretical, it's not that... Well, I would think it's useful. But, like, I think most people would be like, I don't get it. I don't see why this is important. So, I mean, I think, you know, most of the philosophers I know, you know, I think we can all say we have moments where, at least for myself, where I have the short-term memory issue too. That's a difficult one because I think there's a lot to that. As a society, you know, the human race has more of a short-term sort of attention span. So if you're going to think deeply about something and you're going to do it the right way, you have to put your focus on it and you have to sit with it for a while. So I don't have an answer for that one, but yeah, it's a real problem.
So I have one round of questions for each of our speakers. Then we'll just go down the table. All right. It's kind of a wrapping up question. For each of you, so Iyanna has the least time to prepare, but for each of you, I would like your advice for how an individual might best approach the pandemic from the point of view of your field. So, for example, if your message was we need to be more in tune with the earth, what can I as an individual do to engage that concept? Or how can I best be a philosopher in regards to the pandemic, or consider bioethical principles, etc. So, Iyanna, you're first. What it would be a practical strategy for me as an individual to contribute, understand my engagement with the earth?
Mindfulness. Really being thoughtful and considerate about how much you're consuming, the need to want more all the time. Do you really have to go out and buy that extra pair of Nikes, or are you good with the shoes that you have? Like, really being conscious about the choices that you're making, from the food that you're putting in your body to how much toilet paper you're using. Like, literally being mindful about everything. That would be my number one thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the philosopher, it's something similar to that, really. I mean, it's a certain disposition, right, of like this continual questioning and theorizing and sort of, never taking anything for granted, right? Not necessarily just trying to come up with your own opinion to everything, because that's not always useful either, but really thinking and sort of delving into whatever it is you're dealing with, I think since studying philosophy, like, I remember before, commercials were just this thing in the background. Whereas now, I critically analyze every commercial, and I'm thinking about philosophy, and I'm like, mostly disturbed most of the time. But it's kind of a disposition. I don't know if there's any trick to doing it, but, people are wired that way. But they can wire themselves that way too, so.
I think we need to realize we've received an inadequate moral education, and investing in that versus, well, not even versus, but in addition to STEM fields that are seen to provide economic prosperity in our future. So I think it really comes down to developing a true moral curriculum in our schools, when we get to our places of work, regardless of what field they're in. So I think it's a matter of reformatting our education.
Great answers. I would say I think it's constant work. So we've talked about this idea of othering, and that's what we tend to go straight there with pandemics, and I think that's constant work. Pope Francis talks about this idea of we need to smell like the sheep. If we're a shepherd, we need to smell like the sheep. And I think in theology, we need to be with the people and not afraid to be prophetic and speak the truth that we understand and call out what's going on in the world. I mean, I can't tell you how horrible it was to sit in church, and other people know this. You sit in church and no one talks about what's going on. We're just put your head down and say the words to this prayer. And, that's a predominantly white Roman Catholic church. Other churches obviously had different approaches, but that's not approaching the pandemic. Like, we need to be in there in the trenches, helping deliver vaccines. Like, how can we get food to people? How can we be doing the work? How can we be helping out in the hospital? What do we need to do to get more beds? Who doesn't have this access? I think that's the work of the theologian is getting in the weeds when this happens again.
Great. Thank you very much for those comments. Dr. Stone, do you have any final words or comments I'd love to know what you thought of this. I put him on the spot. Don't.
Well, I love giving bombshells. Here's one. I am so glad to have heard these presentations. And it demonstrates how different disciplines in the liberal arts can come around a question interdisciplinarily, and from the disciplinary power of each discipline join in a common conversation. I won't say I was surprised, but I am surprised of how interconnected these papers were, and hearing them, and then I almost wish I could erase it, have a different order, and see what combination I would get the second time. And then, let's see, that's 4 factorial, so I need 24 presentations repeating in different combinations, so that I could just reweave it 24 different times. I think that's part of the beauty of talking about a shared topic from our perspectives. If, with permission of the speakers, we would like to cover these talks in the LMU Weekly, or the BCLA Weekly, and in our BCLA Momentum, to highlight how graduate students take on questions and how they do the work, because indeed you are the next generation of hopefully LMU professors, scholars in the field, world changers. That's what we're trying to do at LMU. We say it all the time to our undergraduates. It is no less true for our graduate students. And so this has been a testament of an LMU graduate education, and I am glad to have been here today and enjoying these papers, and we're going to make sure everyone else hears these papers too. Thanks to the crew for recording, and you all for having thought this through. Thank you all.